Okay, so let's continue our tour of the brain. We started out laying the groundwork, talking about the different lobes, and now we're getting into those different functional and structural areas of the brain. We're going to start with the motor areas, then we'll get to the sensory areas, and then we'll get to the association areas. Now, obviously, lots of different areas that you could go through. There are neurobiologists that study this all the time and can't know everything, and we're just going to do a tour. So, when we're looking at these motor areas, right, these are going to be in control of voluntary motor output, right? So this is going to be going to skeletal muscles, etc. And one of the first things we have is what's called the primary motor cortex. And if we look at where that is, remember we have the central sulcus right here? So that's our dividing line between the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe. And so that one gyrus that we see right there, anterior to it, it's going to be the primary motor cortex. Then we see the premotor cortex that comes right before that, frontal eye field, as well as an area that's called Broca's area. So primary motor cortex is going to be in charge of a lot of those particular movements around the body. And in fact, it's interestingly mapped onto that particular gyrus, where different areas of the body and the skeletal muscles that move those areas those signals are arriving from different areas along this particular gyrus that we call the primary motor cortex. So if you want to move the tongue, for instance, to speak, it's going to come from along the lateral side of that gyrus that we see way over here. If you want to wiggle your nose or something like that, it's going to come from an area right along here, in that area. If you want to move your fingers, it's going to be a little bit higher on the side that we see up here in this area, etc. And you see that areas of the body that have a lot of very fine muscles, a lot of sensory information, etc., and they're very dexterous, you do fine movements with them, etc., have a lot more of that map, a lot more of that geography compared to, areas of the body that we just move in a very general way instead. So that's called the motor homunculus. It's basically the little man, the map of this body that goes along that gyrus that we see there, that we call the primary motor cortex. Okay? So allows conscious control of skeletal muscle movements. Okay, then we have the premotor cortex, which is just anterior to that. And this one helps to kind of coordinate a lot of the movement. So it coordinates sequential actions, simultaneous actions, etc. So if I just want to move my finger, okay, so that's a fairly simple action that I'm doing. But what if I want to grip a pen or something like that, right? I have to move all four of those fingers using some of the muscles that you learned already, right? So flexor digitorum, palmaris longus, things like that. So it takes some complex coordination, and a lot of that comes from that premotor cortex. And it also continues to refine those actions as well, because if I have this pen laying down and I want to grip it, well, I have to plan it out, right? I have to position my hand over it. I have to close the fingers around it, not too soft so it's going to fall out of my hand, not too hard so that I break it or something like that. And then if I want to write with it, oh my gosh, that's a whole lot of very precise actions as well. So a lot of that's coordinated by the premotor cortex. A couple of other things that we saw there in the frontal lobe was Broca's area. And Broca's area is responsible for speech. So it takes coordination of the lips, takes coordination of the vocal folds and the tongue, etc. And so those are all voluntary. And so there's a specific area of the brain called Broca's area that typically controls that. Now it's usually on the left frontal lobe, but it could be on the right. There's also the frontal eye field that we saw there. And the frontal eye field controls voluntary eye movements, right? So you actually have 6 different extrinsic eye muscles that we're going to be learning about that move the eye. There are the rectus muscles that move it up and down and left and right. And then there are oblique ones that come in at angles instead that give you angular movements, right? So all those movements actually are coordinated by the frontal eye field. Now, generally spasmodic movements, maybe not so much, but Okay, so we were looking at this area up here, right? So over here in the frontal lobe. Now what we're going to do is we're going to start looking at sensory areas. And so sensory areas, a lot of these sensory areas are going to be located more in the parietal lobe, even in the temporal lobe as well. So sensory areas, like we said, different types of sensation. So it depends on the sensation that's coming in. It depends on the special sense we're using. Is it about the world around us, about our bodies, etc.? So the very first thing that we see is we have this area, which is called the primary somatosensory cortex. So this is just posterior to that central sulcus. So this is where we get information about the body, what it's feeling like. Do I feel this chair right now? Do I hold the pen? How hard am I gripping the pen, etc.? And much like the motor homunculus is sending signals to all these different areas of the body, and we can map that out, you can do that with a sensory homunculus as well. So we see that over on the right side. So again, as I'm touching my nose, that's going to route to an area in that post-central gyrus, which is called the somatosensory cortex, and that's generally going to be, kind of along the side over here. Now remember, there's that cross communication like that, right? But in any case, we can map that out. That's one of those interesting things where, again, brain surgery, they have the person's brain open, they're finding with electrostimulus, they're finding that somatosensory cortex, and they can just touch it on the brain, and it will give them the same sensation of some sort of a physical feeling in that particular area of the body. So you want to be careful when you're doing that, right? In any case, we started out with, like we saw here, here, the primary somatosensory cortex, right? Right in here. Ooh, that's a good coloring job. But it's right posterior to that central sulcus. Now we also have the somatosensory association cortex. So what this is it's getting information from the primary somatosensory cortex, and then it gathers that information. It's associating with it. So if I am holding the pen, is it cold? Is it hard? Is it slippery? Those types of things. How heavy is it? That gives me a lot of information about this stylus, about this particular object. And so all of that is starting to integrate. And sometimes these association areas are also called integrative areas as well. So we see that in the somatosensory association cortex, a little bit more posterior to that primary area that we mentioned already. Visual areas ironically are located in the back. Eyes are in the front. These processing areas for vision are in the back. So the primary visual cortex is way back here in the occipital lobe. And then there's a visual association area that, again, primary is just like, okay, as we're getting this light information from all these millions of photoreceptors, what does it mean? What is that shape that we see there? Is it dark? What's the color of it? What's the texture of it? Is it moving? Things like that. And then the visual association area is, okay, now that I can see that that's a face, what does that mean to me? Is that chair over there, is that living? Is that person over there? Is that a person like me? Or is that a dog? And if that's a person like me, do I recognize that person? Am I related to that person? Things like that. So that's the visual association area. Also in that occipital lobe. Auditory areas are going to be located near the ear, so that's a little bit more convenient. So the primary auditory cortex is giving you the typical qualities of sound, the pitch, the loudness, whether it's a high pitch or low pitch, things like that, and where it is. There are some reflexes associated with that as well. And then the auditory association is, okay, so I'm hearing these different sounds. Do I recognize this song? Have I heard it before? Where did I hear it before? Do I like it? Do I not like it? Was it associated with some sort of married with some sort of memory about, okay, this is the time I was at the beach, I was really happy, things like that. So that's the auditory association area. Both of those are located right near the ear. The vestibular cortex is a little bit posterior to that we see here. So it's part of the parietal lobe as well as a little bit of the insula, and that gives us an idea of balance. So the receptors for balance or equilibrium are associated with the inner ear, so it makes sense that it's going to be right there, but it gives you the idea about, okay, am I laying down even without the visual stimulus? Am I laying down? Am I straight up? Am I moving? Things like that. There's also an olfactory cortex. Now the nose, right? So you're going to have an eye through here, right? And then you're going to have a nose right underneath that. Ooh, my pen just keeps doing crazy things like that. So it kind of makes sense that those neurons, that those receptors and those neurons relaying that sensory information are going to be found in that adjacent area. So giving you information about odors. There's a gustatory area. So gustation is taste. And so for those are, in an area that's kind of similar to the olfactory, because those two senses are related. They're both chemoreception that we'll talk about later. But that's in the temporal lobe. And then there's a visceral. Visceral means guts. And so that's when we're feeling, okay, my stomach is full, or my intestines are moving, or my bladder is stretching, or something like that. And that is also located along the lateral side there, just posterior to the gustatory cortex. Okay, so motor areas, sensory areas, and now association areas. Before we get to that, one of the interesting things is, when you have brain damage, even though maybe the receptor or wherever it is outside the body, if we're sensing information about outside the body or inside the body, there's two bits of communication, right? There's the receptor and the sensory aspect that's sending the information, that's talking, and then there's the brain that's hearing it and processing it, etc. And so, if you have brain damage, it's possible that the receptor is still sending the right signal, but now the brain doesn't know what to do with it. And so if you have damage to the primary visual cortex in the occipital lobe, your eyes are still working, but you can be functionally blind. Like your brain doesn't know what to do with all that sensory information anymore, and so you can't see, even though these organs are still doing their job. It's very interesting. Okay, association areas. Like we said, inputs and integrative information from a lot of different areas, bringing it all together and giving us a more comprehensive idea about the world around us. So when we look at that, there's an anterior, right? That's towards the front, anterior association area. And this one is very complicated. So when we talk about intellect, your smarts and things like that, also your memory, that has to do with what you know and what you've learned and how you can use it. And also personality, that's a very complex one, right? We all have our different personalities. Somehow that relates to just these neurons going bzz, bzz, bzz. But this area in here is our anterior association area. It also gives us what's called working memory, so you can process things and make decisions and things like that. There's a posterior association area that we see over here, associated with the temporal lobe and the parietal lobes. And this one, like we said, is about recognizing things. So recognizing things and also localizing us relative to those other things. And then there's another very interesting one that's called the Wernicke's area. And the Wernicke's area is located on the lateral side. And the Wernicke's area allows us to understand communication. So for instance, right now, right, your ear is picking up what I'm saying, but those different sounds that I'm making, that I'm intentionally making, right, with my Broca's area of my brain controlling this, are making sounds that somehow make sense to you, right? If you speak English, etc., then it's not just like wah, 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 or maybe it is by this point, but you understand the words that I'm saying. When I link them together, they make sentences, which make ideas, and as I communicate that to you, then that puts an idea in your head. Now, it may not be exactly the same because your brain has to process the words that I'm using. That's a whole other kind of interesting philosophical discussion. Are you actually getting the message that I'm telling you? Because I'm thinking of something, I have to form words around it, around that idea. I use those words to communicate it, but is that what you get exactly what I was originally thinking? Who knows? But in any case, Wernicke's area helps you to process both spoken language as well as written, right? It's not just scribble or something like that. Those little things, if I do, something like this, does that mean something to you? Does this mean something to you? How about this? Does that mean something to you? Right? Because of Wernicke's area, those first two do, and I doubt if that one does. Now, another association area which is really important is the emotional brain, or the limbic association area. So this attaches emotion to the actions that you're doing and the things that you're seeing, etc. And it really helps to cement memories. So again, if you have a good memory or a particularly bad memory, you can remember a lot more detail than if it was just something you passed by in the street and you didn't really think about. So limbic system is buried kind of deep within the brain. We will see this a little bit more, but when we talk about the insula, etc., and those areas that are in deep and around the diencephalon, those areas in here, deep inside, are the areas that are associated with the limbic system, or the emotional brain. So we kind of physically keep our emotions hidden. Okay, so other types of cases when the brain goes awry. So the anterior association area, right, has to do with personality and things like that, even decision making, etc. If there's something wrong with that area, then you can't make decisions appropriately because you don't know how to weigh those decisions out and decide, okay, is that a good thing to do? Is it an ethical thing to do? Is it a hazardous thing to do? Etc. Posterior association area, that one's an interesting one too. So, like we said, it has to do with different types of receptors that are in your joints and in your muscles and things like that. It gives you an idea about where you are, what's part of you, where's my foot right now, even though I can't see it. But if there is a problem with the posterior association area, then all of a sudden, even though you're getting receptive information from receptors in a particular part of your body, the brain doesn't know what to do with it. So it thinks, oh, okay, well, this isn't mine. I don't have any idea about what's going on there, and so this thing is just kind of should go away. I don't have to take care of that. It's not even part of me. Okay, a couple other topics as we wrap up. We said that the cerebral cortex does have some lateralization, where we have one hemisphere that is typically doing a particular function rather than the other. And so what we find is, in fact, for a lot of motor functions, 90% of humans have the left side controlling their motor functions. And so that results in them being mostly right-handed, right? Being dexterous. Whereas about 10% of the population, it's the opposite. Motor function is more on the right side of the cerebral hemisphere, and that means you have a lot of fine control in your left hand, left side of your body, etc. Now, if that right hemisphere if that left hemisphere is busy with things like, motor function, etc., it also can be commonly associated with language and math and logic, right? The logical brain, you hear about that. The people that are left-handed or right hemisphere, they tend to be, it's a correlation, more emotion, artistic, musical skills. A lot of people who are left-handed tend to have more of those artistic skills, right? Like playing an instrument or drawing or something like that. But even though we kind of subdivide the actions between these two hemispheres, there's always going to be communication between the two. And we'll find that there's distinct areas of the brain, distinct pathways that can allow the neurons to communicate between them. And that's going to be always very important. One last thing about the brain and some of its unique aspects of it is that they're finding out that there are now differences not only between left and right, but between male and female brains as well. So when we look at that, what we find is there are certain functions that seem to be more common in certain areas that are bigger or smaller between a male and female brain. So for instance, in a male brain, the frontal cortex seems to be larger. Complex movements, frontal, right? That's going to be our conscious control. So maybe the correlation there is a lot of men are kind of handy. They can build stuff or whatever. I don't know. Also, we find the amygdala. When we talked about the limbic system, the amygdala is part of the limbic system, the emotional brain, and the amygdala is often associated with fear. And so fear can be a big driving factor, fear of being embarrassed or something like that, posturing or whatever, maybe some of those stereotypical male behaviors, maybe. Hypothalamus is also tending to be bigger in males. And the hypothalamus has a number of different homeostatic control points in it, but one of the control points is food intake. And there's that big phrase, right? The way to a man's heart is through his stomach, or maybe through his hypothalamus. Female brains, instead, or I'm sorry, with male, different areas of the male brain that are smaller than female, female brain areas that are bigger, limbic system, bigger in females than in males. There's a trend, right? Females at times can be more emotional, etc. So they have a bigger area of the brain that's maybe dedicated to that. Quite possible. So what we're looking at there is some interesting trends between the structure and the function, even between, like in the temporal lobe, when we talk about communication, right, processing of our written and oral communication and things like that, 12% more neurons in the female temporal lobes associated with communication than the male. Like to talk, communicate, don't like to talk, communicate between the two sides. Maybe there's something there. In any case, something to think about. More discoveries to be made. All right, so we'll stop there for now in our tour through the nervous system. We've started with some of the broad levels of the cerebrum, right? The biggest part of the brain. We're going to work our way in. Diencephalon, we're going to work our way down to the brainstem, the cerebellum, down to the spinal cord, and continue on from there.